G'day guys, I'm Ragnar. Welcome to part 2 of the World of Warcraft Beginner Guide. In this guide I'll be going over the different classes and specs you can play as soon as you enter the game for the first time. There are a total of 12 classes in the game. I'll be covering the 10 you'll have access to when you create your first character. The 2 I won't be covering are the Death Knight and Demon Hunter. These will become available once you hit level 70 on one of the other classes in the server. If you really want to play one of these classes, just level the character to level 70 and then you can create one. Death Knights can bypass this restriction by pre-ordering the Shadowlands expansion. As I mentioned in part 1 of this guide, you choose your race on the left side of the screen here, and each race will have access to a certain number of classes. Some classes won't be available for certain races, but others will. I'll start with Warrior, and I'll work my way down to the bottom. And just remember that I won't be covering Demon Hunter and Death Knight, so you can always check out other guides for those if you're interested. Each class has multiple specializations. A specialization is what role you'll play. They are usually called specs. The 4 main roles are tank, healer, range DPS, and melee DPS. Some classes, all 3 specs will be the same role, like all 3 rogue specs and melee DPS, but all have different playstyles, strengths and weaknesses. Let's talk about the tank. For those who don't know, a tank is the shield hero. Tanks have high defense, high health, survival abilities and high aggro generation. 6 classes can be tanks: warriors, paladins, druids, monks, death knights and demon hunters. Their role within a group is to keep enemies' attention on them and use their defensive abilities to soften the attacks, while the damage dealers in the group can melt the enemies down with minimal interference. A healer would normally be present also to keep the tank alive. If the tank dies, then the rest of the group will have a hard time surviving. All groups require a tank, and they're typically the default leader of the group. Everyone loves to be friends with a tank. You'll be able to form groups and make friends easily if you main a tank. Now let's cover the healer. The healer is a support role. Their main focus is keeping their group alive, including themselves. They shine most where group content is required, like PvP, dungeons, raids, and group quests. 5 classes can be healers: druids, priests, paladins, monks, and shaman. If you're leveling with a friend and dying a lot, maybe one of you should go healer. With some practice, you'll have a much easier time surviving. Forming and finding groups is usually easy as a healer, as like tanks, all groups will need healing. Now let's cover the damage category. Most people call damage DPS, which stands for damage per second. The majority of players play a DPS class, which means it can be harder for you to find groups, and queue times for groups may be longer for you. But that doesn't mean they aren't worth playing. If you just want to do tons of damage and kill things fast, then a DPS is the way to go. Every class has a DPS spec, and some classes are DPS only. If you start as a healer or tank and decide you prefer DPS, you can simply change your spec instead of making an entire new character starting from scratch. Now that we've gone over the roles, let's talk about the classes. The Warrior. The Warrior is your front line foot soldier. They are a powerful melee class that wears heavy plate armor and wields large weapons. The Warrior has 3 specializations: Protection, Fury, and Arms. A Protection Warrior is a tank, and it's one of the top choices for a tank as they have multiple damage mitigation abilities and good AoE to keep the enemies focused on them. They use a one-handed weapon and a shield. A Fury Warrior is a melee damage spec. They're the only spec in the game that can dual wield 2-handed swords, making them an attractive pick for many warriors. They have a few self-healing abilities, heavy cleave, and single target damage. An Arms Warrior is also a melee damage spec. It just uses a single 2-handed weapon, but hits very hard. They can sunder armor and also bleed the enemy. Their playstyle isn't as fast-paced as Fury though. So the Warrior is a good class for any melee action-loving fan, and they make great tanks too. I'd recommend this class to anyone who loves to be right up in the enemy's face. The Paladin. The Paladin is like your Warrior of Light. It uses holy powers to defend, heal, and damage foes. It's a melee class with some ranged abilities. It wears heavy plate armor, but isn't as mobile as the other classes. Paladin has 3 specs: Holy, Protection, and Retribution. Holy is a spec to pick if you want to heal as a Paladin. They have strong single target heals. They can also buff an ally to receive 40% of the healing you do to other allies. This makes them a great healer for keeping the tank alive. Protection is the spec you pick if you want to tank as a Paladin. It's one of the easiest tank specs to play too. They can fling their shield, which bounces to multiple enemies and also silences the first one hit, preventing that enemy from casting spells. They have a few self-healing abilities that can be helpful if the healer is under a lot of pressure and is struggling to keep your health up. They have several AoE abilities, which makes it easy to keep enemies focused on you. Retribution is the melee DPS spec of the Paladin. If you just want to be a warrior that uses the light to destroy their enemies, then Ret Pally is a good pick. The rotation is nice and simple. You pretty much play whack-a-mole with the spells as they come off their cooldowns. Paladin is a good first pick if you like melee and want to try tanking, healing, and DPS in one class. The Hunter. Hunter is a DPS only class, meaning all 3 specs are damage. They can tame animals as pets that can be used for combat. They wear mail armor and usually fill a ranged DPS role. The 3 specs are Beast Mastery, Marksman, and Survival. Beast Mastery is one of the most enjoyable specs in the game for a new player, as it's pretty easy to play. You can tame almost every beast you see, including the exotic ones. You can also move and use abilities at the same time. This is the only ranged spec that can do this in the game with ease. Marksman spec is more based around your range. They can use abilities from further away than any other class. You can still have a pet, but no exotic ones. You're required to stand still in this spec, however sometimes it's worth the trade-off for the superior range and heavy damage. Survival is the melee spec for the Hunter. It has more survival abilities like self-healing and camouflage, which is like a stealth. It also specializes in traps they can set out for enemies to stumble into. Overall, Hunter is a fun class if you like animals and mobility. I recommend trying the Beastmaster spec if you're new. The Rogue. The Rogue is your stealth class. They usually have the upper hand by starting each fight stealthed. They have many crowd control abilities like stuns and saps, making them handy in many situations. They can also pick locks. They can even vanish in stealth and leave the fight if they need to. Rogues have combat points. The idea is to build up 5 combat points, then use an ability that spends them for maximum damage. Rogue has 3 melee DPS specs: Assassin, Outlaw, and Subtlety. Assassin rogues specialize in poison and bleed damage, which are damage over time effects. They apply various types of poison on their daggers to make themselves extra deadly. They have very high single target damage and slows. Daggers are required for this spec. Outlaw rogues are more of the swashbuckler playstyle. They still have stealth, but it isn't as important in this spec, as they're more of a self-sufficient without it. They're very piratey and like to gamble. They can use their combat points to roll dice, which will give them a buff. Most times they'll get a single buff or 2. Sometimes you'll get a perfect roll and get all 5 buffs, which will make you do an insane amount of damage. They are one of the highest melee DPS specs in the game, but are one of the harder ones to master. Subtlety rogues can rely on their stealth to do damage. The damage is done more of a burst, which is great for short fights. They can move faster while stealth and teleport behind enemies, hitting them in the back on their first strike. They are much weaker than the other 2 specs on long fights though, so you don't see too many of them. So Rogue as a whole can be a lot of fun, however they are a more challenging class to master, so they're not the best choice for beginners. But don't let that stop you if you find this class appealing. The Priest. Priest is a spellcaster class. It uses light spells to heal and shadow spells to do damage. You can mind control enemies and even smite them. Priests have 2 healing specs, Discipline and Holy, and 1 DPS spec, Shadow. Discipline has an interesting playstyle. When you cast shield-like bubbles and other various heals on your allies, it will give them a buff called Atonement. When you do damage to an enemy, 50% of the damage heals every ally with the Atonement buff. So the spec is kind of a hybrid healing damage spec. You're expected to heal playing with this spec though. Holy is more of your typical healing spec. Unlike Discipline, it does direct healing to your allies. The spec has strong single and AoE healing. Holy is a great spec if you want to have high throughput healing. Shadow is the priest's DPS spec. It uses shadow magic to damage enemies. You get a shadow form that buffs your armor and shadow magic. Most of your spells are a mix of damage over time, channeled and direct spells. You enter a void form, which will use your insanity resource. This will scale your damage exponentially. However, it takes a lot of gear and skill to remain in this form for long durations. So the priest is a great class if you like to both heal and do ranged DPS. If you like the Lovecraft lore, the Shadow spec gets a lot of inspiration from it. Thanks for watching guys. I'll put the remaining 5 classes in the next guide with intention to keep these videos short. I'll put the link in the description below. If you have a question or suggestion, feel free to leave a comment. If this guide helped you, please like and subscribe for more. This is Ragnarok, and I'll see you in my next guide.